Those who control the past control the future. Those who control the present control the past. In Russia, Vladimir Putin currently controls the present. Therefore, he uses an array of tools to control the past, the Russian history, and rewrite it if necessary. And it seems that is necessary these days. One of the pillars of Russian literature, who wrote of our dark history, incredibly important pages of history of Russia we need to know about. A Nobel Prize winner in literature, prominent Soviet dissident and outspoken critic of communism, and the person who helped to raise global awareness of political repression in the Soviet Union. In particular, he shed light onto the Gulag system. Alexander Solzhenitsyn is proposed to get banned in Russia. Again, used to be Khrushchev, then Brezhnev, then Andropov, then Chernenko versus Solzhenitsyn. Gorbachev finally allowed his books to be published, and we got shocked to learn our country's forbidden history. Yes, that was Solzhenitsyn who we learned it from. Then comes 2023 and it's all over again. A Russian leader banning books of true Russian history. It's Putin versus Solzhenitsyn now. Welcome back to the USSR. Howdy everyone. My name is Konstantin. Welcome to Inside Russia, where I give you news updates, current developments, happenings in Russia, give you my takes and views and angles. Usual Russia explained by the unusual Russian. A very important stream that is revealing of the depth of what has been happening in Russia. I would like to talk about how books are banned in Russia these days. And not only books are banned, but books that had been considered literature classic gold of Russian literature, by most famous Russian authors who are considered geniuses and heroes. These days, in 2023, they are getting banned, or people getting a shot to ban them. Well, without further ado, let's jump right into the message. Well, I'm pretty sure that most of you have heard the name Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He is a very famous Russian, a Nobel Prize winner, and he is the author on the books of Soviet political repression system. Let me tell you a brief history of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and why he is such an importance to us Russians. And then I will tell you what's going on today, right now, and what is going and what this what's going on is leading us to. I will start that, history of Russia has dark pages, real dark pages. Two dark pages are the terror, the red terror that the communists waged upon the Soviet citizens in two waves. The 30s and late 40s, after World War II was finished. Joseph Stalin was the architect of the Red Terror, and it helped him to hang on to power for almost 30 years. 31 years to be exact. The repressions, political repressions in Russia were absolute cosmic scale. Every single family in Russia was affected. every single family had a person, member of a family, either executed, shot to death, they usually were shot, or sent to Gulag to serve 10, 15, 20 years. You know, a lot of people perished without trace and so forth. Understanding those dark pages helps us to explain what kind of leadership the USSR had, what kind of values the leadership of the USSR had, and how people, regular folks, lived in the USSR. You know, those dark pages of Soviet history were highly confidential and hidden far, far away in the darkest corners of the most secret KGB archives. They were personal stories in almost every family. You know, people were talking how the grandmother, grandfather were affected. This information was passed through generations. But there was no public discussion. It was strictly forbidden. No investigations, no discussions anywhere, no documentaries, no movies, nor books, nothing, as it never happened. Millions of people died and perished without trace in the USSR. And it was as it never happened. The fact this was nothing but genocide against the Soviet people waged by the Soviet government. And that fact of that genocide against Soviet citizens was something that people didn't speak about. They were not allowed to speak about. So here comes Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He served, he was born actually in 1918, and he served in the Red Army as a soldier during World War II. Right after World War II, he was detained, charged with treason, and sent to Gulag for 10 years. The charges were he was writing a private letter to his friend somewhere in Siberia, and in one of the letters he criticized Joseph Stalin. He named him a name Master, okay, and that's one of the charges. So he was convinced of treason, and he sent to Gulag, where he spent 10 years. He managed to return from Kolyma, and he just did not settle down quietly, but he started writing. Of course, his books were never published in the USSR. They were banned from being published. And he was considered a non-desirable element of the Soviet system, and he was kicked out of the USSR. Now, he settled in the United States, in the wonderful state of Vermont. He picked that state because he loved Russia so much, and Vermont reminded him of Russia. It had 4 seasons, it had wonderful forests, and so forth. And then that's where his books were published. Alexander Solzhenitsyn became instant success in the West. He became mega popular. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970 for his most famous book, The Gulag Archipelago. 2 generations of Soviet people never knew of the repressions of the Red Terror, what that was happening in Russia over decades, okay? And the writers were banned from writing about it, okay? So the Soviet people never knew, they never had sources to get the information from. And in 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev allowed Alexander Solzhenitsyn to be published in the USSR, and the books came out. I remember reading in the first circle. That was my first Alexander Solzhenitsyn book, and then I read the infamous Archipelago Gulag. let me tell you something. Those books blew our minds. We read them in school. It was extra curriculum reading. It was not part of the official program. But holy cow, my parents read it, and it was very painful to them to realize that the state that they loved, they grew up with, they were living in, was doing such atrocities. They simply hadn't known. So publishing the books of Alexander Solzhenitsyn was hugely important, and it became like a kickoff for public discussions of atrocities of the Soviet state, of the Soviet government. It was very important because not only people started getting information from, the guy who served in Gulag himself, but it was a social contract, so to speak, that the Soviet government had with the Soviet people. For the first time in history, in 70 years, it admitted that the government made mistakes, and it allowed people to learn about the mistakes. That was actually the move, very right move, into a very right direction. The society exploded, basically. Human rights organizations were created, numerous, federal and local. The most famous one was the Memorial, non-profit that Soviet citizens created. A lot of famous politicians, including Boris Yeltsin, participated in the Memorial. And basically that was a way how to bring information, bring the truth into the light, okay? Soviet citizens lacked truth, okay? And then this movement of bringing truth out to the light started big time. There were public discussions all of a sudden in newspapers, on TV. There were documentaries. There were movies being made, There were investigations, research, and so forth. I remember those times. I was a teenager, but it was liberating. It was like a gulp of fresh air. And this is why, to me and to many people, the books of Solzhenitsyn are so very important. That fact of publishing them was the catalyst for the Soviet society. Vladimir Putin himself was a great supporter and a fan of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his works. He met Solzhenitsyn back in 1927, being acting president of Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin visited Solzhenitsyn. He visited his home to congratulate the author on receiving yet another award from the Russian government. And Putin had a conversation with Solzhenitsyn, and it was very public. All newspapers talked about it, wrote about it. Then Solzhenitsyn passed away in 2008, and in 2010, Russian President Vladimir Putin personally insisted that Gulag Archipelago, the most famous book, was made a mandatory reading for all high schools students in the entire Russia. The president of Russia made Solzhenitsyn's Archipelago Gulago a part of school curriculum. Imagine that. He said back in 2010, and I quote Vladimir Putin, without knowing what is described in Gulag Archipelago, and, there the horrors of Soviet system were described, we will not have a complete picture of our country, and we will hardly think about the future. Basically, this quote of Vladimir Putin repeats George Orwell's infamous saying I started the stream with. Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And this is, in other words, that Vladimir Putin said. That's insane. In 2018, Solzhenitsyn would have turned 100 years old. So there was a monument erected to honor Alexander Solzhenitsyn, founded by the Russian government, and Vladimir Putin came personally to open the monument. Okay, at the event, Russian president said that he believed that the best way to preserve the memory of Alexander Solzhenitsyn was to introduce younger generations, students, teenagers, young adults, younger generations of readers to his literary heritage. My God, that's 2018. That's 4 years from now in the past. Let me quote. I'll say another quote of Vladimir Putin. That's just incredible. The most important thing is that the voice of Alexander Isaievich Solzhenitsyn still sounds. His thoughts and ideas resonate in the minds and hearts of people. Popularizing his works, creating conditions for new, younger readers to be able to join him in his books is the best thing we can, and we should do that to preserve the memory of him. Vladimir Putin said. I quoted him directly. 2018, folks. At the same time, Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, who was the president before Vladimir Putin, yes, the same guy who nowadays makes statements so outrageously crazy, as if he was drunk, writing them, and I make entire streams discussing his statements. That same Dmitry Medvedev said, I quote, Solzhenitsyn stays with us as long as we read his books, as long as we find in them an example of courage, human dignity, and ability to live not by lies, but faithfully to the country. The same Dmitry Medvedev said that. A brilliant quote. I'm not being sarcastic this time. So, looks like Alexander Solzhenitsyn had huge support on all levels of Russian society. I remember my school teachers were in love with his works. I was in love. I'm still in love with his works. Even the highest leadership, Medvedev and Putin, were in love, as it seemed, with his works, as it seemed as late as 2018. To summarize what I just said, the period from 1987 to 2022 existed, that we in Russia were allowed to speak freely of anything, more or less, even of the darkest pages of history of Soviet Union. We were allowed to speak freely without fear of being prosecuted, and that was wonderful. Now let's fast forward to 24th February 2022. Our entire lives have been put upside down. We have been seeing these sacred, holy fundamentals of our society started collapsing. And I mean by the fundamental, sacred fundamental values, fundamentals, it's just freedom, basically. Ability to speak freely without fear of being prosecuted. No, wait a second. These fundamentals, they have not been collapsing, okay? They are being deliberately destroyed by the Russian government. And among those fundamentals, let me name you a few. First of all, of course, it's value of human life. I don't know what to tell you. It's become like, value of dust, something like that, from the events that have been happening. The freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom of having access to information, truthful information, the freedom of receiving information, and availability of resources to learn history, to analyze to think critically, okay, to have food for thought, these fundamentals of our society, we had them. It's not like we never had them. After the fall of the USSR, we had them for some period of time, but it ended in beginning of 2022 because the government has gone completely opposite way of everything that it had been doing in the 20 years after the collapse of the USSR. Now, let's just don't go as far. Let's come to today. Well, actually, a couple days before the end of last work week, Friday, 20th of January of 2023. Let's talk about what happened then. That day brought us another shocker. It's like every day brings shocks in Russia, but 20th of January, I'm marking it down in my calendar as a big one. Dmitry Vyatkin, first deputy head of the United Russia Party. That's the party of Vladimir Putin, Dmitry Medvedev, and basically the only party, in Russia. You know who I'm talking about. So, Dmitry Vyatkin, the heavyweight senator in the State Duma Russian parliament, said that there are big changes coming to school curriculums in literature in all Russia. He said that literary works, books that have not passed the test of time and do not correspond to reality, for example, Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, must be removed and will be removed from the school curriculums. Let me directly quote Dmitry Vyatkin. As shown by the historical analysis of the Gulag Archipelago, which has not yet been removed from school curriculums, and I think it will not remain in school curriculum for too long, many facts in Gulag Archipelago was sucked out of a finger by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, invented by him. Historians checked all the facts, and there was an attempt by the author to get a prize for this, for the fact that he had smeared his own homeland and poured dirt all over it. Woo! That's a very powerful, very scary statement. I remind Dmitry Vyatkin that Solzhenitsyn did not attempt to get any prizes. He served 10 years in Gulag and he was thrown there for no good reason. He got the Nobel Prize in Literature for the writing about his experience. And he got numerous other awards, including awards from the Russian government, and Vladimir Putin, acting Russian president, came to visit the author at his house to congratulate Solzhenitsyn with that Russian award. He did not invent any facts. He did not invent anything. The facts were checked numerous times in the late 80s and early 90s, I remember that, and they all were found true. And now this highly positioned politician, one of the heads of the United Russia Party, says things that sound absolutely atrocious, that contradict what his bosses, Putin and Medvedev, said about Solzhenitsyn just short 4 years ago. And Putin and Medvedev are keeping silent about that, by the way. This statement made by this famous Russian senator, heavyweight senator, very important guy who means business, by the way, it shows us a few things. First, the fate of Solzhenitsyn's books and the books of other authors that say the truth about Russia, the good and the bad, the fate of their works has been decided. The senator clarified very clearly, he stated very clearly that the State Duma committee, the Russian Parliament Committee on Culture, plans to collect all the proposals that come from the public control, whoever that public control is, probably the concerned citizens that I mentioned a few times before. So, that come from the public control on artworks that receive budget funding, including films and books. Okay? They are talking about the artworks in where they think that the authors humiliate Russia and pour dirt on it. You know, who are those people? Who do they think they are? They want to have a complete control on what Russian students have access to, what they read, what they watch, what they enjoy, what they admire. I've seen that before. That's total censorship of educational system. I was growing up in that system. Welcome back to the USSR. Number 2, the fate, that statement of the senator shows us that the fate of Russian educational system is very clear and unambiguous. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand what awaits Russian children in schools in the coming years. No good education. As the result of this new educational system adjusted, where all bad guys who pour dirt on Mother Russia are ostracized and, kicked out and prosecuted. As a result of the system, there will be plenty of people in the coming decades in Russia that will believe anything they'll be told by anyone, including the government, and they will not have one single clue about what critical thinking is. And that, my friends, is the end of Russia. Russia will be had. That statement also shows us, number 3, that the Russian government has gained nearly complete control over most parts of people's lives. Some say that complete control might happen in the future, but I say it has already happened. Welcome back to the USSR. And the last, number 4, the ones who are currently controlling Russia's present control its past, and they will likely control Russia's future and the minds of most Russian people in the future. George Orwell was spot on, and I think if he was alive, he would be terrified of how spot on he was, how clear he hit the target. This has been my message for today. Thank you so very much for giving me a chance to. Thank you for coming, watching and hearing me, listening to me. Before I turn on the comments where I would like you to give the feedback, whether you agree or not, perhaps you have questions you'd like to ask or comments you'd like to make. Before I do that, I would like to ask you 2 things. First, please help spread my message by making reposts in social media accounts. And the second, please join my Telegram channel called Inside Konstantin's Russia. The description will be below after the stream ends. That way, it's easier for me to stay connected with you and give you current updates. Thank you so very much. Turning on the comments now.